All right, so today I am here with Professor Karen Ross. I'm Denise Murrow. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Global Governance and Human Security program at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And Professor Karen Ross is a scholar and practitioner whose applied work, teaching, and research sit at the intersection of dialogue, peace building, social activism, and education. Karen's work focuses on understanding the impact of grassroots peacebuilding interventions and the way that these interventions fit into societal level peacebuilding efforts. She also focuses on issues related to how we conduct research about peacebuilding and social justice work, and how we can democratize the knowledge production process, including in terms of how research methodology is taught. In addition to her academic work, Karen is a dialogue facilitator trainer, and evaluator, and has worked as a consultant for UNESCO, GPPAC, and the American Friends Service Committee. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Denise. It's great to be here today.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about your new co-authored book, Making Sense of Social Research Methodology, a student and practitioner-centered approach. And this is co-authored with Pengfei Zhao, Pei-Wei Li, and Barbara Dennis. So to kick us off, can you tell me about how you and your co-authors became interested in this area and how the project began?
Absolutely. So we became interested in writing this textbook as an offshoot of a project that grew out of our teaching. So all four of us were at Indiana University. Pengfei, Pei-Wei, and I were PhD students there. Barbara is still a professor there. And all four of us were teaching an introductory level research methodology course for graduate students at IU in the School of Education. It's required for every graduate student in the School of Education, so there's a lot of sections. And all four of us were teaching it and or had taught it at different points. And in conversations, I think the initial conversation was between Pei-Wei and myself, but we started talking about how for our students who are master's level students or who are getting professionally oriented degrees or licenses in teaching, the kind of textbooks and resources that are available for teaching research methodology often didn't resonate. And a lot of the students kind of didn't see themselves in the readings or the resources that we provided. And in the class as a whole, they really had trouble kind of connecting with the material. So we actually began not thinking about a textbook at all, but began by thinking about how we could revamp this course to better fit the needs of our master's level students. And it started with an action research project that we developed, where we kind of in tandem were together rethinking our curriculum for the course, kind of doing some backwards mapping of what we hope students would get out of the course, and then thinking about how we could best address that through the resources that we used and maybe some different kinds of pedagogical techniques. And also, we thought about, well, how could we really learn about what our students understand about the concept of research, and maybe then sort of test over the course of the semester if their understanding or conceptualization of research actually changed. So, we got IRB approval to do this project. We were revising our teaching at the same time as we were starting to analyze data. And in the course of analyzing, of kind of working together on all of this, we were also privy to messages, or were sharing with one another messages that we were sending to our students to help explain concepts and so forth. And at some point, this discussion started about, we should write a textbook about all of this. And in fact, I just found the email a couple of weeks ago where one of us was responding to another message that had been written to like kind of explain a whole bunch of concepts, and the email basically said, if we just took all of the stuff that we're writing up to explain to our students, we could write a textbook out of it. So that was like, in 2013, maybe. I mean, it was a while ago. And that sort of was the impetus for us to start thinking about, can we actually create a resource that is more oriented towards students who are learning about research methodology in the social sciences, who are going to be using research in their professional lives, maybe not conducting formal academic research, but in whatever kind of professions they have, even in their daily lives. A kind of our starting premise was, we're all doing research in some way, shape, or form. Can we connect the concepts that we talk about in our formal research contexts to these elements of research that show up in everything we do on a daily basis? And that's how the textbook was born.
Thanks. I love that you're connecting this to like real life things that so many people do on a day-to-day basis, and making it that, research isn't necessarily this, thing that only happens in a very formal academic setting.
Yeah, and I mean, it was interesting when we did our first kind of analysis of data we'd collected from students in our classes. We were really only looking at how they initially conceptualized research, right? So I'd mentioned that we were interested in looking at how that maybe changed over the course of the semester, but our first analysis was really focused on trying to understand their initial conceptualizations. And it was really interesting to see how many students kind of understood research to be this thing that experts do over there, right? In contrast with what they do or what they're involved with, either professionally or personally. So I think that really set the stage for thinking about, how can we present the material in a way that draws from their everyday experiences, rather than, in a way that it seems to be so disconnected for a lot of our students.
Yeah, definitely. So as you pursued that action research with the students, and then later on as you were writing the book as well, was there anything that surprised you, or were there any particular obstacles along the way?
Well, I mean, I would say the whole process of collaboratively writing a textbook in a sense, like research methodology is pretty glutted with textbooks, right? So I think the whole process was a little bit surprising in the sense that it was something that I was very much outside of my experience, right? I mean, published articles, published methodological articles. I'd even written a monograph previously, but this was something completely different. And so I guess, one of the things that was really, I don't know if I'd really call it an obstacle, but one of the things that was really interesting to me was just thinking about, how do we frame this material in a way that is accessible? All of us, like, thinking deeply about methodology and writing about methodology in academic contexts, you kind of internalize some of that terminology, that way of speaking, jargon, and so forth. And it was more challenging than expected to find a way to, for each one of us in our own voice, to write in ways that were not assuming certain understandings or levels of knowledge about the concepts. And we were really, really lucky. One of the PhD students in our department currently, Allison Bacta, was working as my research assistant. And at the point where we were kind of going through our final set of chapter revisions, she read every single one of the chapters with an eye to kind of telling us when stuff just still was too jargony or, too academic. And I'm really, really grateful for her doing that. I think it helped a lot. But I would say, I mean, certainly from my own personal writing perspective, just thinking about how to translate all of these concepts that we generally talk about in a very specific academic way, to talking about in a much more, like making the connections to everyday experiences wasn't so hard, but then figuring out how to talk about those connections in a way that was, accessible. Not to say that students won't understand the concepts, but that our language itself was, kind of resonated with the goals of the textbook was probably one of the more challenging parts. And then, as I said, there are 4 of us each writing in our own voice, with our own style. And we were really explicit with ourselves and with the editors at Sage, which published our textbook, that we wanted to maintain those kind of different voices throughout the text. But we also had to find a way to do it so that it wasn't like 4 completely different sets of textbook chapters, right? So that we had some synthesis and kind of across those chapters, and that there were smooth transitions and so forth. So again, I mean, I don't know if I call that an obstacle exactly, but it was definitely a process to figure all of those things out.
Okay, great. I love that you had a student like read over the chapters and point out jargon or, things that were less accessible. But that definitely does sound like a challenge to to work through all of that and actually make it more accessible.
Yes. On the flip side, I would say that we were very lucky to get a couple of grants. Indiana University has a Center for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning so we'd applied for a few grants with them, and then we got some funding from other sources. I got some funding from McCormick, from the Dean's office. And we used those to have a series of writing retreats. I think we did it twice a year. So maybe that we had like seven total between 2015 and 2018. I guess our last one was actually 2019. It was the fall before COVID. And we met, now we're all in different universities and different parts of the country. And so we would pick a place, meet there for about 3 days, and just spend those 3 days like intensely working on exactly those kinds of things. How are we going to deal with like transitions between chapters? How are we going to make sure that these concepts are discussed in the same way across different chapters? I mean, the initial retreats were focused more on just kind of structuring the textbook overall. And then the later ones really, we spent a lot more time on the details of each of the chapters. And I would say that was a really, really, really beneficial from the writing perspective. And then of course, it was also just great to be able to spend that time together working on the textbook, in addition to all the communication that we had beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'd like to, if we can, maybe get into a little bit more of the content of the book and the actual chapters. So I'd love if you could, tell me a little bit more about the book and kind of the central ideas or topics that are addressed in the book. And I know we've already touched on this, but the subtitle about having a student and practitioner centered approach in particular, like why is that important throughout the book?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll address the first part of your question first about the structure. So, and the content. So it's an introductory research methodology book, which means that the content in a sense is not totally different from most research methodology books that you would find in the social sciences. So we discuss, kind of processes of data collection and analysis and the research process overall. I think the approach that we took that really makes this text unique is that a lot of the topics that are discussed either discretely or really not very much at all throughout the research process form the basis for our text. So their textbook is divided into 3 sections, or 3 clusters. The first cluster, I guess, chapters 3 through 8 are kind of foundational concepts that we then discuss in the context of all the rest of the chapters. So we talk about identity, we talk about relationality as a basis for research. We talk about ethics, and ethics as not just procedural in terms of, applying for IRB approval, but what does it mean to approach your research from a place of what's the right thing to do in the context of relationships with participants, designing surveys, whatever the case might be. We talk about making meaning, right? And how that happens, the kind of sociopolitical context that sets the stage for research, and validity, right? So these are all concepts that, in certainly in doctoral level and also in master's level research methodology courses are often addressed, but may be addressed as, like I know I still in the some of the courses I teach talk about methodology kind of at the end of, towards the end of the semester, as something that you're thinking about once you've already kind of done your research and collected your data and analyzed it. Like, how do you ensure that there aren't threats to validity? But, in our text, we really try to turn that around and say, these are fundamental concepts that really are infused throughout the research process as a whole. And how do they then show up in the processes of data collection and analysis? So that's the whole first cluster of the book, is focused on those concepts prior to even really getting into the how-tos of the research itself. And then the second and third clusters are titled Data and Inference. So along with discussing, what kind of data you might collect and what techniques you might use for collecting data and so forth, we kind of also set the stage in those clusters by talking a little bit about what data is, right? So we talk about data as something that's itself kind of representing some phenomenon, right? So we talk a little bit about different ways of understanding representation. And then in the third cluster, we talk about inference making conceptually and, different approaches to doing so, before we get into kind of the more concrete pieces of or elements of the research process. And one of the things that we really try to emphasize, which I know other texts discuss, is the really iterative nature of all of this. So, we have, if you think about the textbook linearly in terms of the chapters, the second cluster talks about data, and the third cluster talks about inference. But I mean, we really try to make explicit how inference making and decision making is part of the process throughout, and isn't just something that you do once you've already collected data in order to make sense of it, right? Like, the making sense process starts before you even, as you're coming up with the research question, essentially. So I think we really try to tie together, or kind of tie those things together in our discussion of the research process, and present it in a way that I think is more reflective of what the holistic process is, rather than in a way that I think we often tend to, I don't know if that's how we think about research, but certainly when, in kind of the linear approach to talking about the research process, like first you come up with the research question, then you kind of figure out what data collection techniques you're going to use, and then, figure out how you're going to analyze your data and so forth. So we talk about, try to, while obviously having to keep a linear approach in the text itself, try to challenge that a little bit in how we talk about it. So I don't know, I think, one of the things that was, I think, very helpful when we were working on the text was that even after we had our contract, our editors at Sage sent batches of chapters out pretty regularly to, research methodology faculty or instructors at different kinds of universities, and who were teaching in different disciplines and so forth. And so we got a lot of feedback from them also about, what they wanted to see, or what they thought was, what they appreciated about it or didn't appreciate about it. And of course, there were some people who really didn't like our approach, but there were some reviewers who were like, yes, I've been looking for a text like this. And it kind of, it was really helpful to hear from those reviewers, at least, that this approach, which I think is actually quite different from the way that most research methodology textbooks are constructed, would be seen in a positive light by instructors, at least some instructors, and hopefully, you know, more than just our reviewers at this point. But I actually have no idea how, you know, what kind of distribution it's gotten so far. And I know you asked me a second part of the question. I can't remember it right now.
Yeah, so I had asked you about the topics, which I think you addressed by kind of talking about these three clusters, and I guess about the subtitle and why it's important to have a practitioner and student-centered approach, which I think you've kind of touched on, but if you want to say anything more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did talk about it a little bit. I mean, really our starting point for this text was thinking about how we can present this material in a way that resonates more with students and practitioners. Also, again, we're all in applied fields, education, conflict resolution. In my case, one of Pei Wei Li is in a psychology program and working with students who are getting, you know, clinical psychology degrees, right? So they may be students now, but they're also going to be using this material as practitioners. And so it was, you know, for us kind of important to think about how do we engage students and perhaps also non-students who are interested in kind of learning more about research for their professional work in this text. And, you know, I think one of the emphases in our work, both in how we interact with each other and in how we've tried to present the material in the textbook, is very dialogic. So there are a lot of kind of elements in the text that are really oriented to speaking with our readers rather than speaking to our readers. And I think in terms of the subtitle of the book, A Student and Practitioner Centered Approach, I mean, really one of our goals is to center students or practitioners who might be using the text rather than bringing our authoritative voices in as the like sole arbiter of what these concepts mean and how we might understand them. So, you know, in line with how you introduced me is my thinking about knowledge democratization, and kind of thinking about how we know and how we understand concepts. Of course, dialogue with readers is a little bit implicit because we're not actually speaking with one another the way you and I are now. But that was kind of, we were really tried to be conscious of how we were framing the text in a way that would draw on their knowledge and expertise rather than just present our own.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. And I'm wondering, I know like, so you've talked a little bit about like readers and about some of your reviewers, you know, in particular, some of the reviewers who are saying they're looking for a book like this. So I guess what kind of impact are you hoping that the book will have, and kind of who are you hoping that it reaches?
Well, first, I hope that it reaches, or it is reaching, every single one of my students for the last, I don't know how many years. You know, the class, the research design class that you were in, Denise, I like used some draft chapters of the textbook there, but I'm using it now in my classes. All of us are using it in our classes. And I've also had the chance, I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to lead a qualitative data analysis training for a group of youth workers in London. So this is one of the, I guess, benefits of COVID, right? That since we're doing everything virtually, the geographic distance doesn't matter so much. And it really drew from kind of the way that we discuss data analysis and techniques for data analysis in the text. And so I was thinking about, you know, from again, a practitioner perspective, right? Who it might reach. The impact I hope it might have, I mean, I know that not everybody is going to either read this text or take a research methodology class where this text is used and come out thinking like, yeah, research methodology, it's what I'm like totally excited about, right? But what I would really like to see through use of this text is students and others who read the material coming away and saying to themselves, okay, I understand these concepts. I can engage in kind of discussion about research, or read research and understand what I'm reading critically, right? So not just kind of read an article and accept it, but be able to say, oh, all right, this person didn't say anything about validity and what they did to address validity in their study, or think about, in their professional lives, the material that they're working with and information that they're gathering, how they're using it, and, how they might present it, how they might make sense of information that they're exposed to. So, I don't know how wide the impact will be. I'd like to think that this can, kind of shift things at a broad scale, but who knows? But I really do hope that to go back to our starting point of this project overall, that it creates a little bit more of a connection for professionals and students in terms of how they see themselves in the research process.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I hope it will have that impact as well. I think that so often research texts do kind of, are kind of removed from day-to-day practitioner work or day-to-day realities. And so, yeah, I hope that it makes that connection as well. So I know throughout the time we've been talking, we've referred to kind of your own positioning as a scholar practitioner and some of your co-authors as well as scholar practitioners. So I guess, would you maybe want to talk a little bit more about how you see the connections between your scholar and practitioner work, and like how that scholar practitioner kind of status fits into or connects with our department?
Yeah, well, I think actually, part of the reason I love our department so much is that so many of both, students in the department and faculty are scholar practitioners, and it's something I don't think is all that common in academic institutions. And so I really appreciate being someplace where that's valued rather than kind of, the practitioner side being seen as, oh, well, that's not really part of your academic work. In terms of this text, I think there's a couple of things that I can think of. First is the text itself, as I mentioned initially, it's itself kind of a piece of scholarship that grows out of teaching, right? And is so in that sense, it's blurring that distinction a little bit. So scholar teacher and scholar practitioner, I don't know, they're slightly different things. But I always think of my teaching as kind of focused on being dialogic pedagogically, and then my practitioner work is really about kind of dialogic, facilitating dialogue, training dialogue, and so forth. So I think there's a lot of resonance in just how these pieces fit together. The textbook itself, like I said, we try to use a dialogic approach, but also in some of the applied kind of research that I do. And yourself, Denise, one of the projects that I've been involved in over the last few years is doing this evaluation work of restorative justice programming at a couple of the correctional institutions in Massachusetts, which you have been working on with me. And so, I'm just thinking about the work that we were starting to do right before COVID, which was, working with kind of putting together a working group of incarcerated men, restorative justice program facilitators, correctional institution administrators, and ourselves, to really think through what a monitoring and evaluation approach for this restorative justice program could look like. And the basis for that, actually, the first sessions that we were facilitating were really about introducing the working group to the basics of research methodology, right? So that we all have a shared language with which to make decisions about, and how will we understand, like how can we define the goals of this program, and then what kind of information might we need in order to address whether the goals are being met, or to understand perhaps what some of the unexpected outcomes of this project are. And even though obviously, I wasn't using the textbook in that context, again, I mean, I think it's really drawing from a similar place of, focusing on or drawing from the knowledge and expertise of the group in order to engage in a research process that has applications for their lives. And so that's something that's really, I think, become more central in how I approach my research. I'm working now as the evaluator on a professional development program that's implemented by the Edward Kennedy Institute right on our campus. This year, so this is going to be the second summer that the professional development is implemented. It's around providing teachers with dialogue skills, or skills to kind of engage dialogue around controversial issues in their classrooms. And this year we're putting together a collaborative evaluation group as well, so that members of the project team and teachers who were involved with the Professional Development Institute last year are collectively making decisions about the research process or the assessment process for this project. So, I think there's like these ways in which the teaching and the research and the teaching about research all kind of fit into the applied work that I do. And I know this is more research oriented in some ways, but also, again, really kind of drawing on a facilitating dialogue about these issues rather than, me coming in as like the outside expert to do the research. So I kind of see it as being at that nexus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know, so you just mentioned a couple of the projects that you're involved in on the more practitioner side, I guess, but still bringing in that like researcher side. So do you know like what's next for you, or what other projects or research do you have in progress, or are you hoping to pursue?
That's a really good question. COVID has really kind of done a number on my research. Obviously, we haven't been back in the Correctional Institute since the first week of March 2020, and it's unclear when that will resume. I'm continuing with this work that Edward Kennedy Institute, which will be continuing at least through the summer. We'll see after that. I think it's going to be kind of contingent on funding, whether they can continue to implement the professional development. Jeff Pugh and I have a project that we've been kind of slowly ramping up over the last several years, where we are trying to understand essentially the role of networks that are formed through participation in educational peace building programs. So they can be like, kind of 2 to 3 week short courses along the lines of the Conflict Transformation Across Borders Institute that Jeff runs, or there's a whole host of other kinds of not actual degree programs, but anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. And the way that relationships formed through those programs can kind of shape continued peace building work. So we are now at a point where we are about to disseminate surveys, hopefully to alumni from a bunch of these different kinds of programs, and also to current peace builders, so individuals working or volunteering in the peace building field, to kind of backwards map the degree to which participation in these kinds of programs, if they participate in these programs, matters for forming relationships, and then the kind of impact of those relationships. So, we've been talking about, as I said, it's been ramping up over the last several years, but I think now we're at a point where hopefully we can really kind of delve into it. And beyond that, I think, I'm sort of waiting to see what happens with restrictions on travel, international travel. I haven't been back to Israel, where I do a lot of my work, in a couple of years now. So, I'm kind of have some potential projects going there, but we've got to kind of wait and see how that all shapes up once we can resume movement across borders more easily.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people are in that wait and see, but those definitely sound like some really interesting up and coming projects for sure. So as we wrap up, what kind of advice would you give to other scholar practitioners as they're thinking about kind of their scholar practitioner work and their research methodology and developing the methodology?
Well, I mean, on the research methodology side, I guess I would say to kind of incorporate research methodology centrally into their thinking about their work, rather than it being something that, like, oh, I have this project, now I've got to figure out, like, how am I actually gonna do it? But really thinking throughout, kind of developing a project, how the methodology fits in and what makes sense in the context of the work. Both in terms of, maybe most effective data collection techniques, but also I really spend a lot of time thinking about how is the methodology that how are the methodological frameworks that I'm using aligned with the kind of work that I am doing. And so I, in general, would like to encourage more of us to be doing more of that. And then, I don't know, on the scholar practitioner front, I guess, first, I've been really lucky to be in a department where both the kind of practitioner side of my work and the research side of my work is valued. But I think it's also, for me, been helpful to really think about, how those pieces fit together. So my scholarship is very much linked to the kinds of things that I do as a practitioner. And my practitioner work is very much informed by the kind of scholarship that I'm doing. So not just necessarily my own scholarship, but the fields that I'm reading in as background for my own projects, connections that I formed through my scholarship and my academic work. And I think that's really also helped me keep, I mean, I wouldn't even call it really like a foot in both worlds, right? Because for me, it's more like it's really kind of helped me keep a sense of what I'm doing as I don't know, I'm not sure what the right word is. It's not unified, but that they align with one another and they're helping one another, rather than being separate from one another in really significant ways. And because of that, I think it's also been easier for me to kind of bring it into my teaching, both in terms of what I teach and in terms of how I teach the material that I do. So it's this like nice little integration of practice, scholarship, teaching. I feel like has been really helpful. And so I guess, for others who are trying to figure out ways to put these things together, finding ways, like finding the connections between them, I think can be really helpful.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Karen, and congrats again on the new book.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.
Of course. So you can find more about Karen's work at her website, www.karenross.net. And you can find the book at the Sage Publishing website or on Amazon. You can find and follow the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at our website and on social media. Follow us to stay up to date about events, news, and the latest accomplishments of our faculty members, students, and alumni. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn.